For 13 days in October 1962, the world came closer to ending than at any other moment in human history. Not a war that killed millions, a war that could have killed hundreds of millions in an afternoon. The United States and the Soviet Union stood eye to eye, each with enough nuclear weapons to erase the other. And it very nearly happened. We were saved not by diplomacy, not by leadership, but, at the final moment, by a single man on a single submarine who said no. This is what almost was, and how close we really came. It began with photographs. In October 1962, American spy planes flying over Cuba captured something terrifying. The Soviet Union was secretly building launch sites for nuclear missiles just 90 miles from the American coast. Missiles that could strike most of the United States in minutes. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice. His military advisors urged him to bomb the sites and invade Cuba immediately. But an attack risked killing Soviet troops and triggering exactly the global nuclear war everyone feared. Instead, Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval blockade of Cuba to stop any more weapons arriving, while he demanded the Soviets remove the missiles already there. Now the world held its breath. Soviet ships were sailing straight toward the American blockade. If they tried to cross it, the U.S. Navy was prepared to fire. And the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had to decide whether to back down or push through. For days, the two superpowers traded threats and secret messages. Each hour brought the world closer to the edge. And then, on October 27th, the day history remembers as Black Saturday, everything nearly came apart. That morning, a Soviet missile shot down an American spy plane over Cuba, killing the pilot. Kennedy's generals demanded immediate retaliation. The machinery of war was one order away from starting. But what almost ended the world that day wasn't happening in Washington or Moscow. It was happening underwater, and almost no one knew. Beneath the Atlantic, near the blockade line, sat a Soviet submarine called B-59. American warships above had detected it and were dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant to force it to surface. But the submarine's crew didn't know they were practice charges. To them, trapped in a sweltering, oxygen-starved hull, it felt like the war had already begun. What the Americans didn't know was that B-59 carried a secret weapon, a nuclear torpedo, and its captain, believing war had broken out above them, decided to use it. A single torpedo that could have vaporized an American fleet and guaranteed nuclear retaliation on the Soviet Union, the first domino of the apocalypse. But launching it required the agreement of 3 senior officers aboard. 2 of them said yes. The third, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He argued them down, insisted they surface and await orders instead of firing. One man, in a metal tube under the ocean, refused, and that refusal is very possibly the only reason you're alive to watch this. But this is the other timeline. So let's ask the question that should terrify you. What if Arkhipov had said yes? The torpedo fires. A U.S. aircraft carrier and its escorts vanish in an instant. To the American command, there is now only one explanation. The Soviet Union has begun a nuclear war. Within minutes, the order goes out. American missiles launch toward the Soviet Union and toward Cuba. The Soviets, seeing the American launch, fire everything they have in response. This was the doctrine both sides lived by. Massive, total retaliation. There was no small version of this war. Historians and military planners who later studied this scenario estimated the result in cold numbers, somewhere between 100 and 500 million people dead within the first few hours. The great cities of the United States the Soviet Union, and Europe gone. But the bombs would only have been the beginning. The smoke from hundreds of burning cities would have risen into the upper atmosphere and blocked the sun, a phenomenon scientists call nuclear winter. Global temperatures would have plunged. Crops would have failed across the entire planet. And in the years that followed, the people who survived the bombs would have faced something almost worse: worldwide famine. In this timeline, the year 1962 is not a chapter in a history book. It is the last year of the world as anyone knew it. There is no internet, no moon landing, no you. The human story very nearly stopped in an afternoon because of a misunderstanding under the sea. Here is what makes the Cuban Missile Crisis so haunting. It wasn't avoided by clever leaders or careful plans. At the closest moment, it came down to one man's judgment, in the dark, under impossible pressure, and the courage to say no when everyone around him said yes. We don't celebrate Vasily Arkhipov the way we celebrate generals and presidents. Most people have never heard his name. But there is a real argument that no single human being has ever done more for the rest of us than the man who, for one moment in 1962, simply refused. We live in the timeline where he said no. Tell me in the comments which moment in history you want explored next, and subscribe, because next week we change another timeline.